Welcome back to my series on creating experiments in PsychoPy. So far, we've been looking at making experiments using the PsychoPy coder, where we code out everything from scratch. Well, now we're going to switch gears and look at how we can build experiments using the PsychoPy builder. And we'll be continuing to use the example I've used in earlier videos where we're going to build a lexical decision task. And I've actually got an entire experiment built for this task in the PsychoPy builder so we can see what we're aiming for. And then what we'll do is we'll start from scratch and essentially reverse engineer this experiment. So let's see this in action. I will click the play button to run the experiment and give it a moment to boot up. It asks for a participant ID. I'll just enter the number 1 for this example. So at the start of our experiment, we see a welcome screen. The participant is told they are about to see a series of characters. If the characters make up a word, press the right arrow key. Otherwise, if they don't make up a word, press the left arrow key, and we can press the spacebar to begin the experiment. So I'll go ahead and do that. Our first series of characters are GHS, which is not a word, so I'm going to press the left arrow key. Bar is a word, so I'm going to press the right arrow key, and I'll just continue with this pattern until eventually we get to the end of the experiment. And here we are at the end. We see a thank you screen, and then we can press the spacebar to end the experiment. So like I said, that's our end goal. And what that looks like in the builder when all is said and done, I'm going to go ahead and expand this window, is if we look down here in the flow, we see the main timeline of our experiment. And within the timeline, we're going to have what PsychoPy calls routines. So in our example, we have 3 different routines. We have the welcome routine. That's where we displayed the instructions and we waited for the user to press the spacebar to begin the experiment. Then we have a conditions routine. That's where we showed our characters. And you'll notice there's a loop here. So we're actually going to be looping through a conditions file where we have each of the series of characters we want to display. We're going to do that on a loop. And then once that's complete, we have an exit routine where we have our thank you message and the ability to terminate the experiment. All right, so within the flow of an experiment, we have different routines that make up the different sections of our experiment. Now, for any of these routines, if we click on them, it'll bring it up in the routines pane. You can see I'm currently looking at the welcome routine. You can see it indicated in this tab here. And within a routine, you're going to have different components. So within the welcome routine, I have 2 components. I have a text component for my instruction text, and I have a keyboard component that's listening for the space bar to start the experiment. Now, the way we add components to our routines is just by choosing them from the components pane on the right. For a given component, there's going to be a series of options we can set to configure that component. And just as an example, let's look at the details or options for our instruction text component. So I'm simply just going to double click on this. It's going to bring up the properties, and we could see things like the ability to set what text is going to display, at what part in this routine should that text start to display, for how long should it display. We can play around with the layout and the appearance, the formatting, all sorts of details about this text. We can set all of this through our text properties. So that's a very bird's eye view of what it's like to work in the PsychoPy builder, where you have the flow of your experiment. It's like the timeline where you lay out the different sections of your experiment, referred to as routines. And then within those routines, you can add and customize different components. So understanding all of that, let's put together this experiment from scratch. So I'm going to start by clicking the new button on the top left. And the first thing I'm going to do is to save this experiment. I'm going to save it on my desktop. I'm going to create a new folder called LDT Builder. LDT being short for Lexical Decision Task, which is the experiment we're going to be building. And the reason I'm putting this in its own folder is because when we run this experiment, certain data files are going to be generated, things like our results, there's going to be log files, and I want that to be grouped together with the experiment itself. So it's a good idea to create a separate folder for each of your experiments. For the name of the experiment, I'm going to call it LDT for short, and just note that anytime you create an experiment in the PsychoPy builder, it's always going to have this PsyExp extension. So I'll go ahead and save that in my directory. And then the next thing I want to do before I start digging into the experiment itself is I want to set up a conditions file. This file is going to contain the different words or pseudo words that we're going to be looping through in this experiment. To set this up, I'm going to go over to the notes that accompany this video, and under the setup heading, you'll see some example conditions we can work with. This is just some CSV data or comma separated value data, where the first row is a header for our data. So the 3 parameters within this data, we have the characters themselves, a Boolean or true-false value as to whether those characters make up a word, and then the expected answer. So for example, our first row of data contains the characters cat. It contains the number 1 for is word, where 1 represents true, so cat is a word. And then based on that, we're expecting the right arrow key as our answer. All right, and we see that's the same for the next 3 sets of data, bar and t. Those are all words, and they're all expecting right as the answer. The last three bits of data are pseudo words, so they're just jumbled characters. So for is word, the value is 0 or false for all of them, and we're expecting the left arrow key. All right, now this is a very small sample set of conditions. Oh, there's only 6 conditions within this file. And I like to start with a very small set of conditions when developing experiments, because as you're developing them, you're going to run the experiments. You're going to have to go through them. And if I had, say, 100 different conditions, that would get very tedious to have to run through 100 different conditions each time. So always start with a limited set of conditions. And then once your experiment is working how you want, you can expand on it later. All right, so let's go ahead and copy this, and I'm just going to bring up a plain text editor on my computer, paste in those conditions, and then I'm going to save this file on my desktop in that LDT builder directory I had created, and let's call this file conditions.csv. All right, so with that all set up, coming back to PsychoPy, let's start to design our experiment. And to begin, down in the flow pane, we want to focus on our first routine, which we can insert routines at any point using the Insert Routine button. But in a blank experiment, they actually start you off with a beginning routine called Trial. So we're just going to work with that, but I am going to rename it. So I'm going to right-click it and choose Rename. And I'm going to name it Welcome Routine. Now, this is a naming convention I like to use in PsychoPy. Whenever I'm naming something, I like to come up with some logical name. So in this case, I am creating a routine that is like the welcome screen. So I'm calling it welcome. And then I follow it by the name of the thing I'm creating. So right now I'm working with routine. So I'm going to call it welcome routine. Later, when I start to add components, when I name things, I'm going to follow them with the name of the component itself, such as things like text or keyboard. Now, the reason I like to do that is because when we run our experiments, sometimes the experiment is going to fail. There's going to be bugs in the underlying code created by PsychoPy Builder. And when that happens, we're going to get some useful debugging messages that are going to refer to the names of the things in our experiment. And if we're more generic with our names, let's say I had just called it welcome, if I see this referenced in a debugging or an error message, it's a little vague. What is welcome? Is it a component within my experiment? Is it a routine? I can't really tell by the name alone, but if I'm more specific when I name it, that'll make it much clearer when I come across that debugging message. The other reason I find this useful is it just makes sure that you're not using the same name in multiple places. I've had this happen where students have created a welcome routine, they called it welcome, and then within there they added a text component which they also called welcome, and that created a problem in the underlying program that was created. So we're just going to be extra specific so we get as much details as possible in our error output and to make sure that we're not reusing the same names in multiple places. So with that little bit of advice regarding naming aside, let's continue on. I'm going to click OK, and we can see our routine is now called Welcome Routine. And it is currently the active routine in my routines pane, so we can start to work with it. And the first thing I want to do is add a text component for our welcome instruction. So I'm just going to click the text component from the components pane on the right. I'll give it a name, so I'm going to call it instruction. And just like I was talking about, I like to follow it up with the name of the thing I'm creating itself. So right now I'm creating a text component, so I'm going to call it instruction text. For start time, I'm going to leave it as the default of 0. This means that this text is going to appear at the beginning of this routine. For duration, I'm going to leave it blank, so I'm going to delete the 1 that it defaults to. If I had left that there, what would happen is this text would show for a single second and then it would go away. And that's not what I want to happen. I want this text to appear for the entire duration of this routine, so I'll just leave that blank. For the text itself, let me jump back to the notes that accompany this video, and we're down here under the welcome routine. I have some copy or example text we can copy in. So I'll just paste that in there. There's our welcome instructions. And for the purposes of our instruction text, those are the only changes I need to make under properties. But definitely take a moment to skim through the different options you have when it comes to setting any of the components we're going to be creating. And note that for any of the inputs on these properties, if you just hover over them for a second, a little dialog box will appear telling you what that property does and giving you some context on how you might use it. The other thing you could do is if you click the Help button on the bottom left, that'll take you over to the documentation to learn more about the properties available. So definitely check out those resources. My goal in this video is not to exhaustively go through every single setting for the different components we're going to be working with. I'm mainly just going to focus on the setting changes we need to make for the purposes of our experiment. All right, so let's click OK and finalize our instruction text. And once it's added, you can see it shows up in our routine. We do see a timeline of the routine itself, and the fact that this blue line extends beyond that timeline just indicates that we didn't set a duration for this text. It's going to appear for the entirety of this routine. Now, following our instruction text, the other thing we need to happen in the welcome routine is we want to listen for the user to press the space key to proceed to the next routine. So to do that, we're going to add a keyboard component. So once again, I'll just click that from the components on the right. For name, I'll call it Start Keyboard. I do want this to begin at the beginning of this routine and last for the entirety of the routine. So we're going to start at 0 and set duration to empty. Skipping down to allowed keys, the key we want to listen for is just the space key. So from the sample keys they give us, I'm just going to narrow that down to space. And that's it for the settings we need to make. So I'll click OK. And there we go. We've now got 2 components added to our welcome routine. And before we go any further, let's go ahead and test and see what we have so far. It's always a good idea to test your experiments as you go along, to build them incrementally. That way, if you run into problems, it's going to be easier to track down where those problems are occurring. So let's go ahead and run it. We'll click the play button. The PsychoPy runner window is going to appear. This appears anytime you run an experiment, and it's just going to provide some background information about that experiment. If you have any error outputs, you'll see that here. The other thing we see pop up is this dialog asking for a participant identifier and a session identifier, and it fills it in with some default values. So this is how you could collect some information from your participant before they begin the experiment. I'm just going to leave it as the default and click OK to actually launch the experiment. And here is our experiment window. We can see our welcome routine with our instruction text. And right before this appeared, you might have noticed there was a previous screen that indicated that PsychoPy was measuring the frame rate of the monitor that we're using. And this is something that PsychoPy can do to get very precise values when it comes to timing. Let's say we're doing something in our experiment where we're measuring reaction time and we want it down to a 1/10 of a second. It's going to be very important to understand what the refresh rate of our participant's monitor is to get accurate values there. If your experiment doesn't have anything to do with reaction times or timing in general, that is something that you could disable. The other thing to observe as we're looking at our experiment for the first time is we see an indicator that we're running in piloting mode. And this happens because if we go back to the builder window, we could see there's 2 different modes we could have run the experiment in: pilot or run. And right now I have pilot active. So when we ran it, that's the mode we got. And this is just like a development mode, which is going to make it so that as the experiment's running, it's going to be logging a lot more details about the experiment behind the scenes, which can be useful to refer to, because if you're actively running and developing your experiment, sometimes there might be problems in the experiment. You're trying to figure out why something isn't working as expected. Being able to refer to those additional logging details can be useful. The other impact of running in pilot mode is it's going to make it so the experiment runs in this single window, which allows you to see the experiment and the builder at the same time. So you can kind of do a side-by-side of what you're trying to create and what you're actually seeing. And this is in contrast to if we go to regular run mode. By default, the experiment is going to run full screen. We wouldn't see any of these other windows or programs running on our computer. And obviously, when you're sharing this experiment with real-world participants, that's what you would want. You want them to focus on the experiment itself. You don't want to see the other stuff going on the computer. All right, so just a couple key differences between pilot and run. But long story short, when you're building an experiment, you mostly want to be running it in pilot mode. When you're ready to share it with the world, you would switch over to regular run mode. Now, in terms of what we expect to see so far, we see our instruction text. The other thing is we should be able to press the space bar. And at this point, the only thing the space bar is going to do is just end this welcome routine. And that just leads to the end of the experiment. So it's just going to cause the experiment window to close. Let's make sure that's actually what's happening. So I'm going to press the space bar. All right, and perfect. That closed out the experiment and brought us to the end, which is what we expect at this point. Now, just to backtrack, I do want to touch upon why that actually happened. Let's go back to our start keyboard settings and just note that we have force end of routine checked off. So what that did is when we press the space bar, it ended this welcome routine. And because there was nothing else that happened after that, that's why we ended the experiment. So now that we've got a good start to our experiment, before we add more routines, I want to pause for a moment and go to the global settings for this experiment. I'll find this by clicking the gear icon. And one of the things I want to customize in here is under experiment info. You can see where we have the details for that little dialog box we saw when we first ran our experiment, where it asked for a participant and session identifier. This is how you could customize that. So let's say, for example, I wanted to get just a participant identifier, not the session. I could remove the session from our experiment info. I could also change the default value for participant. Right now there's some code in here setting it to be a random number. Let's say we just want the user to type in their participant ID. We could just leave that blank so they would have to type it in. If I wanted to collect more info, let's say the participant's name, I could click the plus icon and add additional fields here. Whatever info you want to collect, you could set that up. Or if you don't want that dialog to appear at all, you could just uncheck show info dialog and you wouldn't see that prompt at the beginning. Related to that prompt, when that prompt showed up, it had the name of our experiment up top, which right now it's defaulting to the name of the file, LDT, which makes sense to us, but let's make this a little bit more descriptive, just so that dialog is a little bit more user-friendly. I'm just going to call it lexical decision task. The other thing I want to improve in terms of user experience, if we go to screen, I want to change the background color from the default of gray to black. The defaults in PsychoPy, it's like white text on a lightish gray background, which is not very good for usability. It doesn't offer a lot of high contrast. So something like white on black or even black text on a white background would be more appropriate. So for the background color, to keep things really simple, I'm just going to type in black. And in terms of what colors you can use, there is a little color picker here. You can see there's a whole list of just text described colors you could choose from there. Or if you're used to working with color profiles like RGB or hex colors, and you know the specific color you want to use, you could enter that here and have it insert. But we're just going to go real simple. We're going to go with black background. And the other thing I'm going to do here under screen, at least for right now, is I'm going to disable the measuring of the frame rate. Here was that message we saw when it was doing that. I want to disable it just because we're going to be running this experiment a lot as we're testing it, and we're not really doing anything like recording reaction time right now. So this isn't essential, and I just want to make the testing and development process as quick as possible. So I'm going to disable it. I could always come back and turn that on later as needed. All right, now just like for properties we saw for components, there's a lot of different options and things you could set. So take a moment to scan through there, check out the documentation, hover over the inputs for more context. But for our purposes, I think that's all we need to set. So let's proceed forward and let's go ahead and add our next routine. After our welcome screen, we want to start to display our conditions. So I'm going to say insert routine. We're going to choose new. I'll give it a name of condition routine. There are different routine templates you can work with, and you can see the different options that exist by scrolling through them. I'm just going to go with a blank routine. So I'll click OK. And then down in my flow, I can choose where I want to insert this routine. So I want it to happen after the welcome routine. So I'm just going to hover on the arrow following the welcome routine. A little dot appears, and I'll just click there. And there you can see my condition routine was added. Now the condition routine is a little unique from the welcome routine in that it needs to do something multiple times, right? The welcome screen just had to show the welcome instructions and the proceed forward. With a condition routine, there are multiple conditions we want to show. And the way we're going to set this up is by making a loop. So within our flow pane, I will click insert loop. And then on the timeline, I'm going to indicate a start and stop point for the loop. So right before the condition routine, I will click on the timeline, and that's going to indicate the start of the loop. And then after the condition routine, I'll click again, and that's going to indicate the end of the loop, at which point it brings up my loop properties dialog box, where we can customize how this loop is going to work. Let's start by giving it a name. And then jumping down under conditions, I want to point to that CSV file we created earlier in this video, because that's what I want to loop through, is the different characters within that conditions file. So I'm going to use the open icon. It's already looking in my LDT builder folder I created at the beginning of the video. So I'm going to find that conditions.csv file, open that up, and we can see it was able to actually parse that conditions file. So it sees it has 6 conditions or 6 rows of data with 3 parameters, the parameters being the characters, is, word, and answer, and that's just pulling from the head of that CSV file. So that should be good to go for structuring the loop, but I do want to jump back to num of repeats. It defaults to 5. We're going to knock that down to 1. If we had set it to 5, it would repeat 5 times for each of our conditions, which is not what we want. We just want it to show each condition a single time. So we're going to set num repeats to 1. And then other than that, we're going to leave everything else as the defaults. Our loop type is going to be random, so it's going to randomly go through our conditions. We do want to make sure is trials is checked off. This is going to impact how the data from these conditions is recorded, which we'll see later in this video when we look at the output files. And then we could leave selected rows and random seed empty. Those are things, if you want to learn more about them, again, check out the documentation, or you could hover over either of these fields. But for our purposes, these settings look good, so I'm going to click OK. And you can see our flow is updated now, showing that condition loop. And so now, turning back to the condition routine itself, we need to customize what needs to happen in here. The first thing that needs to happen is it needs to show the condition itself, the text of those 3 characters. So I'm going to add a text component. I'll call it condition text. We'll start it at the beginning of the routine or at the 0 mark. The duration is going to be blank, just like all of our previous texts. And then for the text itself, rather than hard coding the text, we need this to be dynamic based on a variable from our conditions file. All right, and the variable, if we go back to the conditions file for a moment, give me a chance to open it. All right, the variable we want to be displaying here is whatever's listed for characters, either cat, bar, etc. So to reference that in this text input, we're going to use a special character, a $sign, which is just referencing a variable, and we're going to say characters. All right, and PsychoPy is going to be able to make the connection between this variable and the underlying conditions file coming from our loop. Now, an important setting change we need to make for this to work as expected is rather than letting the text be constant, we want it to set every repeat. This is going to make it so it iterates through our conditions in that conditions file. So with that set, let's click OK. And there's our condition text added. And then following that up, we want to add a keyboard component where we're going to listen for the participant's response, which is either going to be the left or right arrow key. So let's call this response keyboard. For our loud keys, we're going to narrow this down to the left and right arrow key. And for this keyboard response, I do want to look at the data pane because I want to check store correct. This is going to make it so that it is actually going to be storing in our data file whether or not they press the correct key. And the way we're going to determine they press the correct key is we're going to compare it against the answer within our CSV data file. So again, using that variable syntax of $sign, we're going to reference answer, and that's going to tie into our data file with the third parameter for each of our conditions. Right, so if they see cat and they press the right arrow key within our resulting data file from this experiment, it should store that they got it correct. All right, so let's click OK to add that keyboard component. And just like we did when we finished the welcome routine, I want to test where we are in this experiment to see how our condition routine is working. So I'll click the Run button. You can see our updated dialog, so it has the name of our experiment up top, and now it's asking just for a participant ID, and it's not pre-filling it with anything. So I'll just enter 1 for test purposes. And there's our welcome routine. We can see our window was updated with that black background. I'll press the space bar, which should bring us to our condition routine. And perfect, we see our first condition. So the word is bar, which is actually a word. So I will press the right arrow key, and that proceeds us to the next condition, GHS, which is not a word. I'm going to press the left arrow key, and I'll just repeat this pattern until we get to the end, at which point the experiment ends. So everything is working as expected in our condition routine, at least in terms of what the participant sees. I also want to check, though, that the underlying data being collected as part of this routine meets our expectations. And where we're going to find that data, if we go to our File Explorer and locate the project folder, we should see that a data folder is created. The very first time we ran our experiment, this folder is created. And then every time we run it, it's going to be adding new files to this directory. And within this directory, there's basically 3 files that are created for each run. A CSV file. This is where we're going to actually have the data that we could use to analyze from this experiment. There's also going to be a .log file. This is going to have technical information about the running of the experiment. Remember when I was talking about when you run it in pilot mode, you're going to get more data logged behind the scenes about the experiment itself. Well, this is where that information is going. So if you run into problems, it might be useful to look at the log file. And then finally, there's this data file, which is a more technical file. This can be used if you needed to dig deeper into the results of the experiment itself. This is actually like a Python-related file that you can open and work with. Most cases, you're not going to need to work with that. You're probably going to be looking at your CSV data. So that's what I'm going to focus on. And I'm going to find the last one in this file. I want to look at the data for the last run of this experiment. And I'm just going to right click it and open it up with a spreadsheet application on my computer. I'm just going to use numbers, but you could use Excel. You could upload this to Google Sheets. However you usually look at CSV data or spreadsheet related data, you can open the CSV file. And skimming through this file, the first 3 rows of data we see correlates to our conditions file. So it shows us which characters the participant was shown in each iteration, and then pulling from our conditions file whether or not it was a word and what the expected answer is. Following the details about the conditions itself, we see a bunch of information that PsychoPy collected, things like the index position within our conditions, right? So the very first set of characters that was shown was Joule, which is actually the 4th element in our conditions file, so that's represented here. Following that, we see some timing information. indicating when this condition was actually shown, represented by seconds from the beginning of the experiment. So the very first condition was shown at 0.72 seconds in, the next one was shown at 0.564 seconds in, and then so on and so forth. And all of that is influenced basically by how quickly I was pressing the left and right arrow keys as I proceeded through the experiment. So if timing is of interest, of course, you could analyze that data. But the main thing we're interested in this experiment, at least for right now, is just whether or not the participant got it correct or not. So to find that information, I'm going to scroll all the way to the right, and what we're looking for is response keyboard.correct, or CORR for short. Here we'll see either a 1 or 0, 1 if they got it correct or 0 if they didn't. And as you can see, I got it correct for all of them. And of course, if you're following along, you could run the experiment and purposely get some of them wrong just to see that the answers are varying here. Now, I do want to emphasize this data here, just jumping back to when we set things up in the builder for the response keyboard, we made sure under data that we checked off store correct, and we said that the correct answer was going to correlate to the answer parameter in our conditions file. These settings right here is what makes this particular column of data possible. Now, the final bit of data I want to highlight is you could see that there is a column for a participant. So you could see how that dialog box of information we collected at the beginning is encoded within our results. All right, now jumping back to our experiment, we know that the core of the experiment is working as expected. We know that the data being produced is as expected. So I think the last thing to do to wrap things up is just adding an exit screen. So once again, we're going to insert a new routine. I'm going to call it exit routine. We'll add a new text component. Call it thank you text. We'll start it at the beginning of the routine and let it last for the entirety of the routine. And then for our text, we'll say thank you for participating. Press space to exit. And then we'll set up a keyboard component to listen for that space. And this is set to force the end of the routine. And because this is going to be the last routine in the experiment, it will effectively close the experiment. So I'll add that. And it looks like I still have to actually insert it. I haven't done that yet. So after our conditions routine and conditions loop, I will click there. And that adds our exit routine. And let's test it out one last time. So I'll quickly run through my conditions. And press space to exit. And with that, that's as far as we're going to take this experiment in this video. I just wanted to give you a broad overview of working with the PsychoPy builder, from setting up your flow with routines and adding components. Obviously, there's a lot more we can dig into in terms of other components that you can work with and advanced details you can set up within your experiment. So I hope you will continue to follow along in the series. I'm going to continue to publish videos digging into some of those details and continuing on this path to learning PsychoPy.